Yeah. So I am delighted at this point in time to invite Mike Gousha to join us. Mike, as I think most of you know, ran his own program up front with Mike Gousha, but he's a longtime journalist, and I actually first met Mike in 1982. He was a cub reporter. I won't tell you what I was doing in 1982, but he now serves as a distinguished fellow in law and public policy at Marquette University Law Schools. He's an award-winning journalist. He's a member of the Wisconsin Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame, the Milwaukee Press Club Hall of Fame, and has received the Associated Press's prestigious Carol Brewer Award for outstanding long-term contributions to journalism in Wisconsin. Most importantly, from my point of view, as a friend of many, many years, he's one of the most decent people I ever met, and he cares about people and he cares about this state. So please join me in welcoming Mike Gousha to the table.
Thanks very much, Jim, for that very, very kind introduction. Good morning to everyone. Great to be with you today. What we're going to do is have a conversation for about 25 minutes with three folks who know a lot about this topic. And we had a brief introduction to Jim earlier. We heard from Dale, the Director of Forward Analytics, the research organization that provides state and local policymakers with nonpartisan analysis of issues affecting the state. As Dale mentioned, he was with the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance for a number of years, and everybody had great respect for him there. And also, Darin Buelow is a principal of Deloitte Consulting, national leader for Deloitte Consulting's real estate and location strategy practices. His services and strategies have guided over 200 major corporations with the deployment of people, facility assets, and equipment around the world. So welcome to all three of you. Good to have you with us. What I thought I'd do is just sort of go down the list here. And I'm going to start actually with Dale, because I want to follow up on a couple of things he had to say. And maybe, Dale, you can help us understand Wisconsin's challenge versus some of our fellow states in the Midwest, the Michigans, the Illinois. Are we facing the same problem? Are we all in this together?
Yeah. So I think we are all in this together. One of the advantages that we have is that Illinois is our neighbor. Which is interesting. When you look at the numbers that I put up in terms of net migration by age between 2010 and 15, Illinois lost among every age group, every 5-year age group except one. That was the 20 to 24, the recent college graduates. So they were going to Chicago, obviously, but every other one they've been losing. But no, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, in fact, really across the country, especially across the northern part of the country, everybody's facing some challenge in demographic challenge.
And is the problem, the workforce shortage problem, particularly acute in certain parts of Wisconsin, for instance?
It's less so in some parts of Madison or whatever, but it's really a challenge everywhere. It's a bigger challenge in the north, and here's why. In the north, one of the things that you typically saw was young people going to college. Where are all the universities in the state? They're south of Highway 29 for the most part. So they were leaving the north, coming south, and then many of them were heading back north. For the most part, you're not seeing that anymore. And so they're losing significant numbers of young women in particular, which means in terms of births, they're way down in births. So their challenges are even more acute than a lot of places in the South. And it's more rural than urban, but to some degree, everybody's facing the challenge.
So Darin, you and your company have looked at this. You've looked around the country, and we know we are in a very, very competitive environment. A lot of places are trying to deal with this very same problem. What have you found in looking at what's going on around the country? Just how competitive is it?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So the demographic problem that we face as a nation it's definitely uneven in terms of how the states are going to experience it. In the South and the Southwest, places like Arizona, Texas, they're attracting people right and left. If you look at the net migration numbers for Dallas, they net migrate about 50,000 people a year into Dallas-Fort Worth. Austin is picking up over 150 people a day. That's about 56,000 people per year. And if you look at other kind of winners around the country, places like Nashville, places like Columbus, these are on par with Austin. Maybe not all the way up to where Austin is, but what's common about those cities, they're capital city, college towns, they're tech hubs. Those are magnets for people. And, this is, it's commonly said there's no, we might say this is not a zero-sum game. This is a zero-sum game, no question about it. For every one of those winners, there's a network of places that are losing people. And in economic development, if we think about how companies make location decisions, how people are moving with their feet, economic development needs to be able to articulate the workforce that they have, the current supply demand, the workforce of the future, how many kids are coming out of school, and is this a place where people are moving to? And places like Nashville, Austin, Columbus, they can check the box on all three of those. And our research shows that Wisconsin is struggling to check the box on all three of those. Our current demand for talent in the state is outstripping supply. We saw from Dale's numbers the forecasted future flow of talent without thinking about people moving in or out is not going to meet demand for talent. And then compounded with the fact that Wisconsin is a net migration exporter. All of those things put us behind the other stars of our country.
Can you give us some examples of what our competitors are doing to attract and retain talent?
Development, there's always been incentives for employers to build plants or move corporate headquarters, create jobs. We want those tax revenues. We want the jobs. And the shift that's been occurring over the last especially 5 years is we've seen an emergence of incentives that are going right to people, to workers. And so communities and states, especially in the Northeast and in the North of our country, have put in place a number of incentives just to try to get people to move in. One example of that is Vermont. Vermont has a fairly well-known work remote or remote worker program where they are offering a 2-year up to $5,000 a year award to an employee that would move to Vermont and work remotely. They announced the results of that program, and so far they've been able to attract in less than a year 290 workers that have qualified under that program, most of whom brought a second adult and several scores of kids with them. So Vermont just last week announced that they're going to expand that program. It's not just going to be for next year, not just apply for remote workers, but they're going to expand that to any non-Vermont resident that moves into the state. They'll be able to qualify for an up to $5,000 reimbursement of relocation expenses. And they were also targeting it for certain portions of the state. If the employee moves to perhaps some underserved or more rural areas, they can get a 50% bonus, up to $7,500 over 2 years. So, this is happening. We're tracking over 20 programs like this across the country, most of which in the Northeast and in the North.
So, Jim Wood, tell us a little bit about what competitive Wisconsin has landed on in terms of what you're looking at that would be most appealing to individuals who might consider moving to Wisconsin. Walk us through what you're talking about.
Bottom line is, as I mentioned earlier, is that we started with the premise that in this day and age, one of the flip sides of workforce shortages is that you wind up with eroding tax bases, which means that there isn't a lot of money to go around. So if you're going to do something new, getting from point A to point B requires you're talking to people about how you're going to pay for it. So we went to look at the workforce shortages to try to understand where the revenue streams were. And where we are is that we are not filling jobs. The Department of Workforce Development at the moment lists some 62,000 projected openings in the top 50 job categories in the state of Wisconsin. And they can give you the numbers of per capita income, et cetera. So we picked three job slots off of that list. A nurse, a advanced welder, and a software engineer. And we said, all right, Deloitte did this workforce, and they went out and said, what does a nurse generate in the first year of employment in terms of public revenues and in terms of private revenues. And we generated those numbers, and so in the public sector you get direct impact, which is pretty much state tax and some local tax, indirect, which is directly related to the job creation, and induced, which is a combination of the two. And so the number for the nurse is, in terms of public revenues, about $8,900. It's not chicken feed, okay? On the private sector side, the two categories that Deloitte looked at for us were additional revenue generated by the employer as a result of that specific hire and changes in the cost of retention and recruitment for that employer. That number for a nurse is $21,000. Revenues, new revenues that you get when you fill a job, none of that takes place when you don't fill the job. So any activity that you can engage in that increases the likelihood that you can fill the job would be of value. That was the premise that we started with. Then, as Darin's already indicated, we asked them to go around the country and look, and they looked at 26 different initiatives around the country. And what we discovered out of that, as he suggested, is you have a financial incentive going on, and it is targeted at younger workers and families, and it is about essentially 3 or 4 things. It's about debt management, it is about housing, and it's about child development. Okay? And there are quality of life issues there that are important as well. And so we said, okay, suppose you could figure out how to put on the table an agenda of things that could be personalized as the employer is talking to a potential employee and say, we have a package of things here. So we ran a number. We said, all right, we looked at the numbers for all 3 of these categories. Our assessment, based upon Deloitte's work in 26 examples, was that we needed $20,000 amortized out over a 5-year period of time, financed 50% by public revenue and 50% by private revenue. That's the basic premise. And we ran those numbers, and we said, okay, what does that look like? And in order to get to that number, we took DWD's number of projected openings, removed what they called the transfer number, so we were just looking at new growth and exits from the particular job category, took the revenues generated, just the direct revenues and just the increased revenues, ran it against a 5-year number for all those numbers, math, et cetera. And the bottom line was, in every single case, both the state and the private employers made money in that 5-year period of time. If you took the big number, which was the direct, indirect, and induced, and the private revenue and the changes to cost of retention, the state, just for those 3 categories of jobs, would have netted we as a state would have netted in excess of $580 million after paying $20,000 a head to fill those jobs. Our premise there is that we've demonstrated that there is a revenue stream, and now the conversation needs to be about how do we activate that? How do we put the mechanisms together?
And briefly, how do you put the mechanisms together?
How do you put that together? What we put on the table, and I want to underscore the phrase "on the table." We believe this is a conversation that needs to take place. We have to move fast and hard, but we need lots of people understanding and engaging in it. And we're prepared to say, God, there's room for you to change it. But I'll tell you what we have started with. We said, where you have workers either in the state or outside the state, and our goal here is to turn Wisconsin into a preferred destination for residential high-demand workers. Okay, that's a goal, right? So for that population ready to go to work right away, what you need is a workforce investment fund, management fund. And the way that would work is, again, back to that employer, that employee sitting there at the table. The employer works out everything related to wages and conditions of employment. That's not part of this. But now that young worker has put together a package worth $20,000 over a 5-year period of time, and there is a contract. There are clawback provisions, the whole ball of wax, and that young employee signs and says, I'm good for it, okay? The employer says, I'm signing the same contract, which means I'm good for the 10 grand, I'm signing on. Package it up, you send it down to the State Department of Revenue, they verify the projections in terms of revenue being generated. Department of Revenue certifies it's the case, and somebody then says, okay, this looks like the state is now committed to paying this amount of money. That goes to the workforce, that package goes to the Workforce Investment Management Fund, and they look at it and evaluate it as a worthwhile investment or a not worthwhile investment. If they say it's a worthwhile investment, it starts right away, but no money gets paid until the first tax dollar is paid. So you're not creating jobs, you're filling jobs. It's a different exercise, and when nobody's gambling here, there's money, projections are there. So that's one place where we've started and said we think that's an important thing to at least think about, work our way through. The second piece is there's a second category of potential people who would come to Wisconsin, and that's people who are not quite ready to go to work, but they're ready to learn, they're ready to train, they're ready to certify. And we have, there's a massive amount of wonderful educational infrastructure. And there we need a bond structure. So we're looking at something for working titles called a worker pipeline bond. Okay? And this premise is that, again, that person would sign a contract with an educational institution or a training or certification institution. My own preference is that we would target the millions of millennial children in the 5 states surrounding Wisconsin for all sorts of reasons. But I think we can bring students into this state and use our infrastructure in a creative way. Ultimately, the same revenue stream pays back the bond. Okay, it's when they go to work they start generating that money. It's the same process, but you have to deal with getting the money and using it for a period of time before that. There is a third piece which we have not spent much time on, but I'll put it on the table. Part of what's important here is communities. Right? The strength of the communities, the ability to attract and retain, create opportunities for young people. We have a unique opportunity in the state of Wisconsin because we've got 16 to 17 markets like that with educational infrastructure, great stuff going on. But their tax bases are eroding. So the question is, how do you empower that out of this new revenue or revenue that found revenue? And there are models in Wisconsin and elsewhere of community economic development foundations. The Potosi Brewery is one of those. And so we want to look at that, and we're suggesting that regions take a look at the question of whether or not some of the indirect and induced monies that are generated as a result of finding jobs, if you could figure out demonstrably how to measure it, if you didn't take any more than 10 or 15% of it, and if you could figure out what you were going to spend it on, and you had responsible people, we think that's a model worth looking. I've taken way too much time, but what I want to say again is those are the 3 things that we put on the table. There are other things that people may want to look at, and we want people to look at these and add your suggestions and your ideas and your thoughts about how we might refine these. The one piece I will tell you is it is critical that these be sustainable. None of the 26 programs that Darin looked at around the country are, in my opinion, sustainable. Sustainable means to me that the program is paid for by the revenues it generates. Everything else was a budget line, which means you can't promise it'll be there. Everything else was a grant, which eventually runs out. Everything else, there are a couple of what I found where they start, they've got money and they're using the interest off of it. But we really think it's critical that it be tied to the revenues generated from filling the job.
Thanks for the explanation, Jim. I wanted to ask maybe Darin, but any of you is welcome to weigh in on this. Is what Jim just described enough to attract workers to Wisconsin or potential workers to Wisconsin? You mentioned earlier that a lot of people want to go to the Sun Belt. They want to go to low-tax states. Wisconsin is not a low-tax state, and while we have sun in the summer, winter is a different animal. Is this enough to put us on a competitive footing with some of these other places?
It's a fair question, Mike. It's safe to say that the structure that Jim has outlined with a potential $20,000 benefit over 5 years to the worker, that's significant. It compares very favorably to the other programs that are out there, most of which are in the $5,000 or $10,000 value range. I think it's interesting to note the sustainability comment that Jim had. I think that's really important. That under this proposed structure, we're not, the state and the private companies are not giving away money that they're not collecting. So it's once the job is filled and it's certified, then and the taxes are rolling in, then that is in effect rebated. But will it move the needle? I think it'll make a difference for some workers that are trying to decide between different options, that maybe would be mulling offers by employers in the state, and this kind of program, which doesn't exist today, could definitely tip the scales. I do think this is something that should be piloted. We should see how it works. If it's decided to go forward, see how it works, see what the results are, publish an annual report, and make decisions about whether or not it's something that the state should continue in the future.
Dale, you've been talking about this since 2004. Is this one of the first pretty well thought out design plans to address this, or have there been others that just haven't gotten wind behind them?
I think this is well thought out. I think I want to answer the question of is
please.
this enough?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a start. But one of the things I think is millennials, the generation that's following them, are different than most of us in the room. In that, when we were young, we found a job and we moved to whatever city that was that offered us that job. Millennials are a little bit different in that, for many of them, they're willing to move to a city, a community that they think they like, and they're figuring they can find a job. So one of the other pieces here, I think, is we have great educational institutions, et cetera, but we have to also make sure that our municipalities, our counties are attractive to that generation. We have very strict revenue limits on municipalities that, for the most part, prevent them from doing some of the things that young people would like. So I think part of this also has to be making sure we empower our cities and villages and towns to build on their strengths to make their communities attractive to those young populations.
Let me ask a quick question about the practical implications of this. If I'm an employer and I'm entering into these employee contracts that provide a certain amount of assistance to people to live their lives, what happens when other people in the company know I'm making those deals? Is that a problem for you? Does that create an upward pressure on a whole bunch of different metrics for an employer?
So the short answer and honest answer is yes. Okay, but you can't do this anymore without talking about context. Okay, so if I were the employer, I would say, when I can't fill this job, okay, I can't execute the business that people want to bring me. I mean, one of the biggest challenges we have in Wisconsin right now is we've got a relatively healthy economy, but we can't get the production levels up, okay? So I'm not earning more money to pay you more money, okay? So the fundamental system, the network that we've built, isn't working for you any more than it's working for me. And I'll take it one step further. When that job doesn't get filled, property taxes don't get paid, so your school gets damaged and your roads don't get fixed at the same rate. So this is about survival. This is not about, are we comfortable? And at the risk of overstating, the house is on fire. We can argue about what color you want to paint the kitchen after I get the fire put out. And so it's why we are always careful to talk about this program is targeted at high demand residential workers, okay? It's not to say that you can't develop an approach to deal with other workers, but I think that the benefits that the employees already in the companies will garner are in their school systems, in their roads, in their opportunity, in the kinds of things that Dale was talking about in terms of being able to keep their children within 150 miles or 200 miles of where they live, those sorts of things.
Darin, I'll give you a final word on that. As somebody who's an employer, I mean, does it create a whole new set of challenges for an employer if you go down this path?
I think it's possible. I also think that every deal that an employer that an employer makes with a recruit. There are different signing bonuses and different deal packages. I mean, that's just part of life. That's part of our free economy. So I don't place too much worry of mine in that particular bucket about how others are going to feel about this. I mean, as Jim said, the house is on fire. I think the demographics that Dale showed exemplify that. We've got a real problem in the state, and we need to fill those empty jobs, or things will spiral out of control.
And I'll give Dale the final word on that. Is the house on fire, or has it been on fire for a while?
The house is definitely on fire. It was embers before, but I think we're at a point where we need to do something yesterday. Really, it's only going to get worse as we move forward. So the sooner we put something in place, the better off we're going to be.
All right, I'm going to wrap things up there for the first panel. Jim, did you want to have anything else to say, or okay, wrap it up right there. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.